Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. So in our last session, we talked about components, props, but right now if you take a look at our application, it's very static. In general, real applications aren't like that. They have dynamic behavior, they have user interactions. So today what we're going to do is take care of that using hooks. And we'll start with a discussion on how to integrate images into our application. And then we'll talk about useState, useRef, and useEffects, which are just examples of hooks. At the end of the video, we're going to be able to write our own hook to be able to grab asynchronously data from an API. So let's get started. Let's dive straight back into our application. So in our last video, we talked about components and props and how we can pass props from parent components down to child components. So if we take a look at our app right now, we can see that we have some variables kind of in the global scope. We have our header, we have a footer, which I folded, and then we have our main. And then down here, we have our application, which basically calls on each one of these components. We have our header, our main, and then our footer. The props are passed down from the application down to each one of these components. Before we continue, I want to start by talking about images. Images in React are slightly different than they are in HTML because they're acting as assets that we need to import. So if you take a look at this assets folder in our source folder, I have a bunch of images that I can act as assets. Now the difference between the assets folder and the public folder is that in our assets, these are the files that React will actually view as part of our application. So it will find the best way to bundle it, to minimize everything that's inside in the bundling process. So whenever we need something to be part of the application itself, it's best to put it in the assets folder. So what I want to look at here is the react.svg file, which is just a React logo, and I'm going to import it as part of my assets. And the way that we do it is we just do import logo from, and then we need to find that folder. So now our logo variable is going to act as the asset that we can put into our application. So let's pretend that I want to put it into the header. So here under the H1, our image tag is still going to look like the img, except for the source, we no longer have a string, but we have the asset itself. So we're actually embedding it directly into the source attribute. All right, I'm going to also add an alt here, and I'm going to give it a class name. Let's call it logo. All right, I'm going to then go into our app.css and let's add a class to it. This code is actually from the default application when you install React. So I've just copied it back into our app.css file. And now let's run it. So npm run dev is going to create our server. And if we jump over to our server, it looks like this. Now, before we move on any further, I want to add a little bit to the main. So notice right now the main is taking the people list and is just printing out a unordered list with a bunch of LIs. I actually want to add a component in here. So I'm going to create a function called person card. I'm going to receive a variable called person. And person is going to be of type person. So I'm going to pass down a person type down to person card, and the job of person card is simply going to render out this component. So I'm going to make a fragment. And let's just say the way that we're going to render out the person card is we're going to print out the name and then the age. And then let's add a horizontal rule, and let's take away the horizontal rule that's under the main. All right. So now when the main is going to render out each person, we're going to, instead of calling the li, we're just going to pass this into a component called person card. And we're going to send along the person as well. So we're going to pass it as a prop person. Okay, now instead of the ul, we will make it a div. All right, so one thing we forgot is if you take a look at person card, remember every time we have a list or a collection of something, we're going to need a key. So we're going to label the key prop with the person ID. All right, so let's see what it looks like currently. Jump over to the app. It looks like this. So right now it looks pretty good. Let's add a line break for all of these places. And now here's our application so far. All right, the next thing I want to do is let's rearrange our data a little bit. So notice that we have our components. We have our header component, footer component, person card now, and also our main. And the app is sending down these props, but these props right now are actually in the global scope. So what we want to do is actually logically put all of these variables into the component that it belongs to. So first, let's take a look at title. So where does title actually belong, or which component actually owns the variable title? Now, we could say that it's actually part of the header, so maybe it's in there, but we might need the title for other components along the way. So I'm just going to put it in app for now. And similarly, what about the tech list? Now, again, tech list, you might argue, is only in the footer. So I might actually put it in the footer. But again, we might need the tech list for other purposes. So I'll just put it in the highest part of the hierarchy in the app. So the final thing is, what about people list? Now, people list, I would argue, is only going to exist inside of main, right? So we don't actually need people list in multiple parts of our application, only in this main component. So instead of putting people list in the app component, I'll actually push it down to the main component. So in main, this is where people list is going to live. So I'm going to copy over our people, and now I'll put it in the main component. Now, similarly, I have to rename this people list to people, and now main doesn't need to take in the people list. It already owns it. Okay, so let's see what's happening. Main owns the list of people. For each of the people, it's going to send down a person down to person card. Okay, so I think right now it looks pretty good. The variables are nicely organized. We'll deal with type in a second, but for now, let's take a look at our application. It looks the same as before, which is good. So let's think about the state or the data of my application. So when a component runs, it will run from top to bottom, and whatever it returns, it's going to return a subtree. But notice that every time this component runs, it's going to run the same code and it's going to end up with the same subtree. So that's really what's happening in our application right now. It looks a little bit static. But what if that component itself can reach outside into the React internals and it can save a state? So for example, maybe we can have a count that is 0, and then every time we run the component, we're going to increment the count, and that's going to increment it in the React internals. So think of it as kind of like a global state that you have. And so every time we return a subtree, we're going to be able to reach into that state, and we're going to be able to update as we go. Coming back to our application, let's put some states in it. So the first thing I want to do is let's add the number of users as a state. So in order to do that, we're going to invoke a hook, a React hook called useState. Now how useState works is that it's going to return two things on the function call. It's going to give us the variable. So we're going to call one of the variables numPeople. And then it's also going to give us a set function. So set numPeople. So this is the update function for the numPeople variable. And this is going to come back from useState. When we call useState, we're also going to need to pass in the initial value. So let's say the initial value for useState is equal to 0. And in order to use state, we have to import this from React. So we're going to go into import useState from React. All right, so as I said, when we invoke the useState function, this is going to give us an array of two things. The first one is the variable. So this is the React internal, and this is the way that we're going to update this function. All right, so where we want to use this is let's come down here to back to our main. And after we print out the people, we'll create a button which says load random person. Now, when we click on this button, I want the numPeople variable to increase by 1. So on click, I want it to fire a function that does the following. It's going to call set numPeople, and it's going to take the previous state. So the previous state is basically the previous number, and it's going to increase it by 1. It's going to return previous plus 1. So this is basically how we're going to set the numPeople. We're going to take the previous number, we're going to add it by 1. Just to see what's happening, I'm going to make a paragraph, and in here, I'm just going to print out the numPeople variable. All right, so let's see what's going on in our app. Okay, so you can see that we have a 0, and then we can click on this, we get 1, get 2, get 3. When we click on this, there is a click event that happens. And when that click event happens, it's going to fire this function, set num people, which is going to get the previous state of num people, and it's going to increase it by 1. So this is what you're seeing. This is what's happening. Okay, now this code might look familiar because this is basically the boilerplate code that we got from React when we started this application. All right, so let's go a little bit further with this. I'm first going to create a few more people so that we have more data to work with. All right, so later on, this num people is actually going to act as our ID, but for now, let's just continue with this example. All right, so another thing that I want to add here is just expand our state a little bit. So I'm going to create another const, and this time I'm going to create a people list, and I'm going to have a function set people list. And then again, I'm going to go use state, and this time I'm going to give it the initial value of people. All right, so the way that set state works is that whatever variable that it's associated with, when that variable changes, it's going to trigger a re-render of that component. So for example, when num people changes as a result of me clicking this button, this main component is going to re-render. Okay, similarly, I'm going to attach people list later on, and when people list changes, then I want to trigger a re-render of this whole component. All right, but before we do that, let's come back to the people. So people is actually of type person array. So let me just label that, and let's change the definition of person very quickly. So I'm going to add a few more variables in here, or a few more attributes in here. So I'm going to add an attribute called fav, which is a Boolean. And also I'm going to add a profile pic, which is a string. All right, so fav is going to be a Boolean that indicates whether the person has been favorited or not. And then the profile pic, which I'll leave it optional for now, is one that I'm going to use later on to display the person's picture. So let's come down here. You'll see that React is actually complaining a little bit because our data shape doesn't match. So let's just say that when the person gets created, the fav variable is automatically going to be false. So they're not going to be favorited unless we do it. All right, so now I'm going to give the functionality to be able to change the favorites as we go. So this is going to give us an ability to toggle the favorite. So let's create a function called const toggle fav. We're going to need an ID, which is a number. And this is going to give us a functionality where we're going to go through the people list and we're going to find the person associated with the ID. We're going to take the previous list of people, and we are going to map it for each person to see if the person ID is actually the ID that they're passing in. If it is, I'm going to return the person, but this fav attribute is now going to be the opposite of person.fav. So we're essentially toggling this favorite, but if it's not, then I'll just return the person. Okay, now this function, we're going to pass it down as a prop. So we're going to have a toggle fav, which we're going to pass down as a prop. So this is nothing more than a function that I'm passing from one component to the next. Now the problem is that when we defined person card, we haven't specified that there's going to be a function that comes along with it. So we have to specify that definition as well. So I'm going to do a toggle fav, and toggle fav is going to be part of the definition. Toggle fav is going to be a function that takes a ID number and gives a void. In our person card, let's create a span. And inside of this span, we're going to display a heart depending on whether this person is favorited or not. Check if this person.fav is true, and if it is, then we're going to display the heart, but if not, we're going to display an empty heart. Okay, now the final thing we want to do is inside of this span, I want to call on this toggle fav. So on click, I want to call this function toggle fav, and I want to call it with the person ID. Okay, so now let's take a look at our code. So in our person card, we're going to pass in a person fav. Actually, I should probably spell it correctly. And then inside of this person card, I'm going to display the name and the age. And then depending if they're a favorited person, I'm going to display a red heart or an empty heart. And when I click on this span, I want to be able to call on the function toggle fave, which simply is going to toggle the person. Now notice that when this people list changes, I want this whole component main to re-render, which means that this people.map should really be people list.map. All right, so from the people list, I'm going to take each of the persons, I'm going to pass it down to person card as well as this function toggle fave. So let's take a look at how this works. All right, so we have right now all of the people. And now when I click on this, you see that it toggles. Right, so what's happening is when I click on this, this is actually sending the toggle fave. It's calling the toggle fave function. And it's changing the state of the people list. When the state of the people list changes, then it's going to trigger a re-render of the main component, and that's what you're seeing here. This is basically the main component being re-rendered every time I make this click. Okay, great. Just to finish off this example, let's come over to the span, and I want to add a class name here as well. Let's call it heart. And in my app.css, I want to add a heart class, which is going to be cursor pointer. And let's make the font size slightly bigger. All right, so now you can see that when I click on it, it actually looks like I'm clicking on a button, and our random person still works. So if we click on this, this is going to give me the number of people that we have. Okay, next, let's add another hook. So another type of hook in React is called a useEffect. And in order to use the useEffect, we have to, again, import it. And the parameter that's inside is going to be a function that is run on a dependency array. So the first one that will, the second parameter of useEffect is going to be an array. So we'll leave this empty for now. And I'm going to simply put a console log in here. Okay, so I'm just going to say triggered. If we now take a look at what's happening, we're going to rerun this application and notice that it says triggered, right? So no matter how many times this component gets re-rendered, notice that the triggered doesn't get printed again, right? So no matter how many times, so every time I'm interacting with this, the main component is actually being re-rendered and re-rendered. So notice trigger only happened once. Okay, so what I'll add to this dependency array is I'm going to add a variable that is going to trigger a re-render, which is numPeople. Now remember how numPeople triggers a re-render. When I click on that button, the numPeople is going to increase by 1, which is going to trigger a re-render of main. So you see here, if we start again, if I click on this, it's going to trigger a re-render. Okay, so notice here, every time I click on this button, numPeople increases and this triggered gets printed out. But if I interact with these hearts, notice that numPeople doesn't change, right? But the UI gets re-rendered, but this useEffect never gets called. Okay, so basically what this array is telling us is as a result of which variable getting updated is the render that's going to run this function. Okay, hope that makes sense. So I'm going to leave it as numPeople, and I'm going to show you one other thing here, which is what I can use with useEffect. So right now, all I'm doing is console logging, but instead, what if I wanted to check for the maximum number of people that I have? So for example, if I have if numPeople is greater than people.length, then I'm going to set numPeople back to people.length. Okay, now notice right away, React is kind of complaining because our linter is seeing the semantics of this code. So what it's seeing is that inside we have a dependency array that is involving numPeople. But in here, we're setting a state. So notice that when we set a state, this is going to trigger a re-render, and possibly this is going to trigger the useEffect.run, and then which triggers another re-render, and so on. Right? So I hope you can see the problem. There's a possibility that there's going to be an infinite loop if we're not careful. So that's what React is complaining about. But for now, nothing is actually wrong because our code is actually correct. But what is happening is as we continue on, and if we reach the maximum, this 5 never goes above, right? Never goes above 5. Okay, now since we're here, because we are actually printing out the person card, I don't want to map the whole person list, but in fact, I want to first slice it from 0 up to num people. I only want to display that many people. Okay, so let's see what it looks like right now. So initially, our num people is 0, and when I click on load random person, it's going to give me a 1, which is going to load the first person. See, triggering the re-render, and then I'm going to trigger the re-render again, and the re-render again, and the re-render again, and so on. Right? So this is as part of the use effect. All right, so once we reach 5, notice that if I try to click it anymore, this num people is not going to increment anymore. And if you see, momentarily, this 5 actually turned into a 6 and then back to 5. Right, so you can probably guess what's going on here. When I click on this button, the num people is going to increase by 1, making it 6, triggering the render. And then the use effect runs, which puts the num people back to 5. Right, so there's kind of a tug of war going on between the use state and the use effect. I hope you understand what's going on here, but this is not going to be our final code. So that's really what React was complaining about. All right, so let's talk about one last type of state, which is called a useRef. Okay, useRef is actually very similar to useState, except it doesn't trigger a re-render. So the way that we use useRef is we're going to create a variable. So const, we'll call it next ID ref. Okay, so this is going to come from useRef, and we'll start at people.length. Okay, now in order to use useRef, once again, we're going to need to import it. So we're going to import useRef. And how useRef works is that it's basically a reference, right, that is going to be kept internally. But here, unlike the state, the next ID ref, when it gets incremented or when it changes, it doesn't trigger a UI change. So instead, references are used for internal purposes. Like, for example, if I want to keep track of an ID and I don't need to necessarily trigger the UI to change. All right, so let's come back to our use effect here. So we're going to say if the num people is greater than the people.length, then I'm going to reset the num people. But at the same time, I want to set our next ID ref, and how we access the value is .current, and I'm going to do a plus plus to increment it by 1. All right, so once we're here, then let's console.log. We'll say next ID, and then we'll just print out the next ID ref. Okay, so let's see how this works. So we're going to load the random people. So you see that we're loading, we're loading, we're loading. So I should have put current here. Okay, so let's try this again. So we're loading, and then once we reach 5, you see that our next ID is going to be 6. We click it again, it's going to be 7, and then 8, and then 9. Okay, so notice that this reference is actually kept internally and it doesn't trigger any type of UI render. Okay, so you might take a look at this use effect and say, oh, it's kind of stupid because it's actually doing nothing. And you're right, it's actually doing nothing. So the final thing we want to do here is let's take a look at our application as a whole. So I'm just going to close up a lot of this, and then let's go from the top down to the bottom, and then let's see what our application structure looks like. So at the very top, we have our app. Our app is rendering out our header, our main, as well as our footer. Now in our main is where we keep the people, okay? And we have a bunch of states in here that keeps track of the people, and we have a function that allows us to be able to toggle the fave, which in turn is going to change the state of the people. So for every person in the person list, the person is going to be passed down to the person card as a prop, as well as this toggle favorite. This function is going to be passed down as a person card as well. And in the person card, this is where we display the actual person as well as interact with this toggle fave. So we're able to call this function within this component. The originating component is actually main. So now if we take a look at main carefully, we actually have two states here that are kind of related to each other, the number list as well as the next ID reference. So one good way to kind of organize all of your states is actually to write your own hook. So we're going to do that as a last exercise in this video. So I'm going to create a function, use fetch random user. All right, so for fetch random user, I'm going to have a trigger, which is going to be a number. Now, later on, this trigger is actually going to end up as the num people. So whenever the num people changes, I want to trigger fetch random user. Okay, so this is going to be a hook that I'm going to create myself. Now, a random hook is actually nothing special. It's just a collection of different states and use effects that we can lump together into one function. So the first thing we'll do is let's create the people list. So I'm going to have a people list, and then we're going to set people list useState, and I'm going to give it a generic of person array. And initial value is going to be empty array, which makes sense because that is initially what's going to happen. We have no people, and then later we're going to have 1, and then 2, and then 3, and so on. Okay, so next we're going to have a next ID ref, and our next ID ref is going to reference the next ID, so we'll start with 1. Okay, and another thing that we're going to keep track of, another state that we're going to keep track of is this loading state. Now, this is pretty common in React applications when we're doing things asynchronously and when we're waiting for network connections and so forth. It's always good to set a state to loading or not loading, depending on what the state is. So I'll show you what that looks like in 1 second, but initially our loading state is going to be false. Okay, depending on what the trigger is or when the trigger changes, this is going to fire a useEffect function. So once again, the useEffect function is going to be run based on a dependency. Now in this dependency, it's going to be trigger. Okay, so when the trigger changes, what I want to do is run this function. And this function essentially is going to grab a random user from online. So I'm going to try, and I'm going to set loading, first of all, to true. Okay, so at this moment, we are loading. Then we are going to await a new promise. So what we're doing here is we're going to simulate a network delay. So we're going to send a resolve and then a set timeout, and we're going to call resolve after 500 milliseconds. Okay, so this is just a simulation of the network delay, and then we're going to grab the data from the API. All right, so we're going to have a const response is equal to await, and then we're going to fetch from this API called random user.me/API. Now, before we move on, let's just take a look at what this API does. So you see, every time we send a request, it's going to give us a random person. So first, we have a attribute called results, and results is an array. Actually, it's an array of only one item, so it's only one user, one person, and it gives us a random name, a date of birth with an age, as well as a picture. So for now, those are the things that we need. And then notice that we also have info seed. So this is important because later, if we want to grab the same person again, we would need to send in the seed to get the same person object again. Otherwise, we're just going to get another random person. So I'll tell you what that looks like or how to do that in a later video. Okay, but for now, let's remember what that data looks like. We're going to change this data into JSON form. So data equals our response dot JSON. And then we're going to keep track of a few variables. Okay, then we're going to give it a rule for setting the people list. So set people list. When we grab a new person, we're going to take the previous list of people, and we're going to return the previous list of people along with this new object. So this new object is going to have an ID, and the ID is going to be the next ID reference dot current plus plus, as well as the name, the profile pic, the seed, the age, and then we're going to do the fave. Okay, and finally, we're going to catch any errors that come up. And if there are errors, then let's just console log it. And then finally, we're going to set loading to false. So let's take a look at what's happening here. I actually forgot something here. So useEffect is actually running a function, but this needs to be asynchronous. So I'm just going to add a few more things in here. So I'm going to say if the trigger is equal to 0, then I'm simply going to return, because when the trigger is equal to 0, I don't want anything to be loaded, but then I want this asynchronous function to run. So let's call this function fetch random user, and I want it to call fetch random user here. Okay, and then after all of this, I want to return the people list, the loading, and also set people list. All right, so let's see exactly what's happening here. We wrote a lot of code, but our use effect is basically going to be controlled by this trigger. So when the trigger changes, and I'll show you what trigger is in 1 second. When the trigger changes, I want to run this fetch random user, which is going to call on this API. The API is going to grab a user at random. We're going to take some of the attributes of this person and we're going to add it to the person list. And then we're going to set the loading to false afterwards. Okay, so we're going to do that every time trigger changes. Now you could probably guess what trigger is. Trigger is going to be this num people. Okay, so let's get rid of some of this stuff that we don't need. I'm going to comment out the people because the people list in our hook that we just wrote is going to take care of all of that. Similarly, the people list, we don't need that anymore. And this next ID ref also, we don't need that anymore because we moved all of that into our use fetch random user. Okay, I'm going to keep those there for now. At the beginning of the next video, I will delete it. Same with this use effect. I don't think we're going to need this use effect anymore. So I'm going to comment that out as well. Okay, so now in our main, we can use this custom hook that we wrote, use fetch random user, and we'll have people list loading and set people list is equal to use fetch random user, and then the trigger is going to be num people. Okay, so now I hope everything is coming into focus. So our num people is the state that we're keeping track of. The num people is going to change when we click on this button. So when we click on this button, it's going to trigger this use effect to run, which is going to grab a random user and it's going to update the people list. Okay, so that's everything that's happening. Let's make everything look a little bit better. Under toggle fave, I'm just going to create a person that kind of simulates a loading person. Okay, so what is happening when we're loading? So we're going to do a loading person, and it's going to be of type person, and it's just going to look like this. It's going to be name is loading. So you'll see why I name it like this in 1 second. The age, it really doesn't matter. And the fave is going to be false. And the ID is going to be -1. So I put ID -1 to indicate that this is a loading person. And how we're going to display this is we're going to display our person list first of all, but then afterwards, we need to check if our state is loading. So if our state is loading, then we're going to print out a person card. But instead of passing in a real person, we're going to pass in loading person. Okay, so when it's in a loading state, we want the person card to render out this loading person. All right, so you'll see what this looks like in 1 second. But again, let's run through the whole code. When we click on this button, the num people is going to change. When the num people change, this is going to trigger this use effect to run, which is going to grab a random person. Now, at the same time, notice here, we're actually timing out for 500 milliseconds, which is half a second. So you're going to notice that we're going to render out a loading person in the meantime, and then we're actually going to get a real user. So let's finally take a look at what this looks like. We'll rerun this application. When we load a person, see, notice it was for a second displaying loading, and then the new person comes up. So it displays loading, and then a new person comes up. So this is basically what we have so far. One last thing I want to add to this is when we're displaying the people. So notice here we have a profile pic. So let's actually display the profile pic as well, since we have that as our part of our application. So in our person card, after the age, we'll create an image tag with our source person.profile pic. And then we'll just say for the alt, we'll just say profile and then another end of line. Okay, so let's take a look at what this looks like. So it looks something like this, which is pretty good. So we can toggle the fave, and then we can add another person. We can toggle the fave. It's not perfect yet, but we're kind of well on our way. So what we did so far is we talked about the components, we have props, and then in this section, we started talking about states and how we can use hooks to kind of control the life cycle of React and be able to keep track of the data that's currently in our application. Okay, so that's all I have for this video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.